International Campus is a developer, operator, investor in student accommodation and micro-living, co-living based in Germany. We're currently active in Germany as on home turf, in the Netherlands, in Austria, in Hungary, in Czech Republic, and in Poland. We currently have some 5,500 beds in operation. And if we add those in various stages of delivery, we end up at around 15,000 units all over Europe.
Great. Nick?
I'm Luke Dawson. I'm Regional Managing Director and Head of Capital Markets for Colliers across Central Europe. Colliers is a global commercial real estate advisory and agency. We've been active in Central Europe for well over 20 years. We've now got 14 offices across 6 countries. And student housing is one of the priority asset classes for us, hence the focus in this report, because we do believe that it's going to be one of the futures in Central Europe.
Samuel.
Thank you. I'm Samuel from BONARD. We are an independent research provider for student housing and micro-living asset classes. We are based in Vienna, but with 4 offices in Europe and Asia and Australia. Our main focus is to provide unbiased, unpolluted, independent data to bring more transparency to student housing asset class and basically measure the standard metrics that bring investors, investment managers, and developers less risk and more profits.
I'm Wojciech CMS. CMS is the best law firm in CEE with a strong real estate focus.
But I wanted to start off, we're going to kind of divide into roughly 3 areas, looking a bit more at the occupied demand, development, and then investment. And I wanted to start off with occupied demand. Obviously, in the report we heard a lot about the international market, but obviously, Samuel, you drill down and look at the demand in a bit more detail. What are you finding is driving occupied demand?
Well, as the report said, and Mark commented, I think that the region of Central and Eastern Europe is becoming to a stage where probably Western Europe or Ireland and Netherlands were 7 to 10 years ago. And it's an increasing number of international students. These are mostly, though, intra-regional international students. So the structure of the international population needs to be taken in notice. These are not the long-haul students like Chinese, Indian, Brazilians. The universities have very strong interest to have them. They pay tuition, they pay for accommodation. The cities want them as well as a destination because they have new talent. And later on, some 30 to 40% of them, they want to stay, so the cities have lifetime taxpayers from them. So there is a multi-stakeholder interest to have more international students, and they usually prefer structured accommodation. Now, I would say the map of that region was even, I would say, optimistic in terms of supply. We have sort of 4 levels of PBSA, or purpose-built student accommodation. It's a religious, public, private, but out of the private we have the sort of converted hotels that are in Bucharest or Sofia or even in Prague or Bratislava, which we don't necessarily consider to be private stock per se, where international students necessarily want to be. And then we have private competitive stock. And it's almost non-existent. It's even less that the report features, and that's the second driver of the dynamic in the region. To answer your question, it's absolute lack of supply. So there was a project in Brno 2 years ago, 200 rooms, 240 beds, that for €420 per month, which is quite high for the region, or above average, let's say, 100% occupied in 2 months. So it's more international students, lack of supply, And the third level is, I would say, this private competitive PBSA is like an iPhone to 10 years ago. So we have a button phones in the region. Everybody is using old-fashioned product, and suddenly a new sexy product is coming to the market, like Milestone in Budapest, for 473 euro per month an average price, and international students want to live that. So that's also a factor, that it starts to be fashionable, let's say. Last factor is private rental market. So when you look at the price of a single studio in Warsaw or Budapest, which is about 450 to 600 euros. So the international student who wants to stay in a decent accommodation, not in public dormitories, but decent accommodation, needs to pay 450 to 600 euro anyway. So if they have the same price in a private PBSA with community and all in one bill, so no care about internet and other things, why would they not go there? So all these four factors contribute to a relatively huge boom and interest for this asset class. From investors' point of view, the build cost is really low. It's about 50,000-60,000 per unit, whereas the transaction price 5-7 years from now over there will be about 140,000-150,000 per unit. So the gains at the exit in a relatively short period of time will be phenomenal, like they were in Ireland last 7 years.
I want to come to you in a moment, Rainer, but I just wanted to pick up on the point that Mark's making about domestic students. I mean, obviously you talked about international students being like what's driving the demand, and particularly from Europe rather than long haul. Do you see a case in the future where there could be more demand from domestic students?
From my point of view, yes, in simple answer, because unlike some of the Western European cities, the Eastern or Central and Eastern European cities have extremely high number of English taught programs. So when you look at Bratislava, the small city, few universities, and they have 256 English taught programs in the city. You don't find a Western European city of that size with so many English taught programs. And they have no other choice. They don't have domestic students, as Mark said. So they have to attract the international students, and the only way is to have English taught programs. And English taught programs, low cost of education, some of the ranked universities combined bring attraction of long haul students. It's not only the traditional long haul source markets like China, but Saudi Arabia and Gulf region, so deep pockets, interest in medicine like in Budapest or Brno, so these kind of students.
So when I wanted to bring you in, obviously you're developing, what are you seeing from, obviously you're there responding to a particular demand, but where do you see it going?
Well, I think in the first instance, we're talking about CEE, but CEE is far from being homogeneous when you look at the higher education sector, and if you look at the motivation of young people of going there. As Samuel rightly said, there are more or less 2 or 3 main pockets. One is the Western students going into these countries. Then you have the intra-regionals and domestics. If you focus for a moment on the Western, we have seen Erasmus programs figures exploding over the last 5-6 years, and especially Prague was one, and to a certain extent Budapest was on the winning side, in addition to Iberia, for example. And what you also need to take into consideration, there is a certain entry grade driven tourism into locations like Budapest or Prague, or also into Polish universities, where you have in, let's say, core European market, the situation that the numbers of students have risen way sharper than the absorption capability of the system. So when it comes to medicine, for example. You see a lot going into Budapest, going into Warsaw, going into Prague, because here it's more a pay education than an entry grade driven education. And for example, in Budapest, you might know Semmelweis still lectures in German, and there are a lot of German students. And in addition, as Samuel rightly said, the number of English taught courses compared to the size of the universities is outstanding in the European context. And in the light of this, we see a situation as typical for immature markets, fast-growing demand from student populations growing, also the affordability pockets are moving upward, and no stock existing, and you can't solve this overnight. So there is a cycle of development necessary, which will take 3, 4, 5 years to start balancing the imbalance that you currently see. And this is something which is highly interesting and attractive for us, and that's why we decided 2.5 years ago to acquire our first sites in the region. And Poland, for example, for us is more a country approach, while Czech Republic and Hungary is more a target city approach. We started our journey into Poland in Krakow, and we're currently actively looking in other cities like Katowice, Warsaw, Gdańsk, Lublin, Wrocław. So there's a way bigger opportunity in Poland than in the other CEE countries from the perspective of creating and gaining size over time.
Do you see that changing?
Well, I think there is a likelihood that also secondary cities like Brno or Győr will move into focus over the years. But as we are all backed by international institutions on the investment side, their appetite for starting in secondary or tertiary cities compared to primary cities is typically limited.
Now, you touched upon holidays and the summer periods. Am I right in there's a slight difference in student accommodation in Europe in that they almost have a dual purpose and that they're used all year round, but as tourist accommodation at other times. Perhaps you could maybe talk a bit about the sort of the slight difference, because I don't think that's something we see a great deal of here in the UK.
Well, in all over Europe, you have various models on how accommodation is structured and designed. For example, in Germany, it's more a 12-month thing, primarily. In Spain and other countries, it's more a sharp borderline between the academic and the non-academic part of the year. And we see these trends also in some of the CEE countries. For example, in Budapest, you then have the situation, even you shut down for summer, or you temporarily roll out a different operational model to embrace summer occupancy and driving further revenues. And for example, Budapest and Prague, and to a certain extent also Warsaw or other places, have booming tourism figures and display high attractiveness for all kinds of tourists. And our accommodation model is more than appealing to the younger ones, the backpackers, those who would typically end up in hostels. And as the quality of accommodation in these countries tends to be a little bit wobbly, there's also a difference between, let's say, a hostel in Prague or Budapest, or the opportunity of staying a week or a few nights in summer in a purpose-built student accommodation block. And this is something that we need to factor in. And this also leads to the situation that currently the preferred licensing model in CEE is hotel. So it's not residential, because this allows to factor in summer occupancy models into your business model.
Okay, so I wanted to come on to talk a bit about regulations. We'll also talk a bit about where we are in the development cycle. But perhaps I could bring in Wojciech here. How easy is it to get planning and develop first and foremost in Central and Eastern Europe?
Well, the message from the lawyers is surprisingly good, is that there is hardly any regulation in the region regarding student accommodation, which is a surprise, and nothing from Brussels so far. So this means that it's relatively easy, but you of course face the normal challenges which are probably everywhere, and in CEE in particular, the average challenges of developing anything in this world, but which means that you need to have proper planning, but in many cases, in many jurisdictions, you can get a planning permit. What is important is that regulations vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. It's not that CEE is many countries, and each has its particular laws, but nothing about student accommodation as yet. If you look at what the first projects that have been done in Poland, for instance, they were usually redevelopments of hotels, and the reason being that it falls under category of hotels. So you usually student accommodation will be considered as a hotel. In some jurisdictions, some people treat it as more residential, but the fact that it's operated more like a hotel than anything else, it allows this flexibility, this summer flexibility, and this means that you can actually, you've got occupants not only 9 months in a year, but you can also count on tourists coming in other seasons, which is probably important, especially in bigger cities where there is lack of affordable summer accommodation for tourists, and this is really competing with hotels. So it's good news. It's good news. Anyway, some challenges exist, as they exist when developing a hotel or anything else.
Such as anything?
Well,
any highlights
it's CEE. You've got some bureaucracy that takes time to get the proper planning, the planning permits. But it's no different than developing an office or a hotel building in a way, in terms of how long it takes to develop something. And generally, CEE is improving in this respect in many ways. So it's good news.
What about, I mean, I'll probably bring Rainer in on this actually, and maybe some of the other panellists, but is there much competition for development for other uses?
I can take that one. Yes. I think if you're looking at student housing, there's a lot of talk about it. Everybody is generally very positive, but part of the reason why I think the development hasn't caught up to the supply is really because our markets have been so successful in other areas. So when you're looking at the residential development and the residential prices, even if you're looking at the general commercial pricing over the last few years, residential, depending on the market, has gone up anywhere between 30 to 50% in the last 5 years, right? So if you're a developer and you've got a great plot, you could basically go buy the land, finance it through pre-sales, and sell it onward. So your risk in terms of your equity and generally your time frame of that money is very, very short. Whereas if somebody comes and says, look, we want to do a student housing project, it's not as clear cut. You've got to find an operator, you have to figure out the financing to get you through construction because there's no pre-sales. And then when the markets were taking off and prices kept climbing, there was really not much incentive for your average developer to look at student housing. They like talking about it and they always said, we're going to do it. But in terms of actually putting the money into it and going ahead with it, it really didn't happen because the markets have taken off. Where that might change is when you look at construction prices right now. And construction prices are growing faster than even the home prices have. So as construction prices press up on the home prices, I think the developers will start looking for how do we kind of maximize their returns even more. And I think student housing might be one of those options because it allows you potentially more income on a per square meter basis. So we're hoping that happens, that construction prices actually somehow will push student housing to be more attractive.
I think one of challenges is that underlying income is in local currencies. So you run a. Whereas if you're building operating a shopping center, an office building, usually in CEE the rents are denominated, euro denominated. Whereas you expect that the students even foreign students will probably pay in local currency.
Rainer, just for your question for you would be, is this rent set in local currency or euro?
We charge rents in local currency, yeah. And coming as an addition to what you just said, Luke, you can clearly see, if you, let's say, look back at the last 3 years, there's a lot of development activity in other asset classes, driving construction costs, driving land prices, and especially in Czech Republic, it might take a significant time to get a building application in place. So there's also a certain lack of available product. And from an investor's basis, if you, let's say, decide whether I invest in a CEE country or in one of the core economic countries in Germany, in Europe, your expectation is that you have a higher spread between development yield and exit or investment yield, factoring in political situation, economic situation, and also currency aspects. And at some 3 years ago, spreads were north of 300 basis points. And currently they're coming down in a range which is more typical for established European markets. So if you look into Budapest, for example, prices have gone up tremendously. Yeah, rents on a way lower growth path than this. Yeah, if you ask me, if you would consider doing something in Budapest today, you could go into other markets where you have a way higher stability on the framework around it. Yeah, and this is, from my point of view, the current challenge this segment faces in some of the CEE markets. Yeah, that the heat has been rising pretty fast.
And student accommodation is encyclical, right?
Yeah.
We've got some questions coming through on Slido. Thank you for all those that are submitting and liking. This one has got quite a few likes, and it's going back a little bit to the demand. I'm hoping one of you can answer this. Is how does the quality of education in this region compare internationally? Is there a concerted marketing program to attract foreign students? I don't know whether Samuel, is that something you can answer?
Well, when it comes to the quality of education, a number of ranked universities, that this region is not as at the level of Western Europe or traditional heavyweights like UK. On the other hand, when you compare the value and price, that's probably for the target audience of those international students who can afford certain quality of education for certain costs. What was the second question? Promotion, concerted effort.
Marketed, yeah.
Pretty similar, like with everything. Like Central and Eastern Europe is probably 15 years behind Western Europe. So Western European countries like France, Germany, Ireland, they have concerted effort of national governments that have strategic papers and national strategies how to attract more students, and not only at the national level but also at the city level. These only exist in Poland so far. The other countries like Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, I'm not aware of the concerted effort or budgets allocated for this, or some recruitment efforts overseas. Hungary is shaping a national student housing strategy, but they talk about that. They have been talking about that like 5 years, and this is not very likely. Doesn't seem to be very likely to happen. So, long story short, both the quality of education and the concerted marketing effort to get more international students is behind Western Europe, probably those 10 years roughly. But we see that there is more and more appetite in this regard, starting with Poland.
I think one thing to add is that the diplomas obtained from universities are recognized in the whole EU, which makes it possible for people outside of EU to study and obtain a diploma which will get them a job, medical studies, for instance, in any EU country, even if, at the price which is much lower than studying in London, for instance?
One potential add-on, it usually, like it started in Scotland or Germany, this concerted effort, marketing effort starts bottom up. So particular universities started, they have national plans how to attract more students. Later on, 3-4 years, they start to meet their colleagues in Vietnam or Saudi Arabia, recruiting students there. So they say, let's create a cluster, you know, like study in Scotland, you know. So then they create a cluster, study cluster, they chip in some money. This is usually 50-50 ratio with the government, so they complement it with additional budget, and they start a concerted effort. But the region is not there yet.
Okay, I'm going to pick another question from here that's getting a lot of likes before we move on to talk a bit more about the investment side. Indicated pricing for PBSA rental in Warsaw exceeds the cost of shared renting a flat. Won't that limit demand for PBSA?
I don't think that this is a specific question which Warsaw or other markets in CEE face. Interested to hear your view as well. But we are in a world where not one product needs to fit all. Yeah, we have in each and every country different offers at different price points, going along with different quality, and my takeaway of being in that sector now for 10 years is that you have an increasing trend amongst young people looking for community, being amongst peers and not being somewhere in a resi area in a sublet. But the limit is affordability. Yeah, so it's not that the sky is the limit when it comes to rents in that sector. So in each and every micro market, you need to accept some, let's say, economic framework in which you need to operate your scheme. But there are various clusters of price points which you need to take into consideration. And this goes along with the different target groups. As initially said, Western students are looking for more Western style accommodation, which goes then along with more Western European price point. Interregionals are shooting primarily for lower price points. And then the question for people like us is, how can I structure my offer to serve various price points and to embrace as much of the potential target group on my offer?
Okay, so I wanted to move on and just talk a bit about, we've talked a bit about occupier demand, we've talked a bit about the style and the competition for development, the style of development. So let's talk a bit more about investment. We've touched upon a few points already. So Luke, how big is the appetite for investment? We've heard a bit from Mark, but from your perspective, what is the appetite?
Well, I think you have to split it into a few different things. If we had standing assets with the track record, the demand would be off the charts, because there's piles of people that would say, look, I'd love to buy into student housing. But it goes back to the supply issue of there not being enough supply. So you kind of have different pockets. You've got traditional investors that are looking to come in with just equity. They don't necessarily want to develop, and they definitely don't want to operate. And then in some cases, you've got operators who are looking for sites, but they don't have the equity to go ahead and actually develop it and purchase the property. So demand is there, but at this point, there's too many different players that you need to put together in some cases to make it all work, because you need a developer who's willing to do it, you need a structure that allows them to finance it, you need an operator that's going to take it over afterwards, and you need the equity that's going to actually come up in the beginning to finance the whole project. So not to promote Rainier and his group, but it requires more groups like IIC that can kind of do it all at this stage to kickstart it. And I think that's what we're really missing, because I'm sure whenever you have a product that you're ready to sell, we could sell it for you in a few weeks if you want. But right now, there's just not enough standing assets, because it's always a puzzle to get these things done. And
okay, so there's plenty of demand out for the product. What type of people? What type of investors are actually circling the market a bit?
Well, I think if you had enough scale, you'd see the large private equity groups coming in. But it's a scale issue because they're not going to come in to buy a 20 million euro asset in Budapest, right? They need to have kind of minimum 200-300 million in assets as a portfolio in multiple countries and multiple cities to make it work for them. But if that supply was there, I mean, you see it in the UK. A lot of the bigger groups have some kind of private equity backing or large kind of sovereign wealth funds behind them. And until we get to that scale, it won't happen. Right now, the investment is probably more from smaller private funds that would like to invest in the segment. But again, they lack the development capability to do it themselves.
So perhaps coming back to from the development, obviously, to you need the stock in order to do the investment deals, and we've talked a bit about the competition from residential developers. Are you seeing more increased competition from developers looking to build student accommodation? Is that side of the market, or is it people not kind of cottoned onto that yet?
For sure, we see now since, let's say, 12 months that these markets benefit from increasing publicity, attractiveness, and there are new entries now. And there are groups coming from all over Europe, like us. And this leads to, let's say, an additional layer of competition for relevant opportunities. Yeah, but still the biggest competition is with other asset classes.
And in terms of other developers you mentioned, is it mainly European developers, or are you seeing an international market there as well?
Definitely, those I think who are currently active is US, UK based, and now the second wave is then coming from other areas in Europe, like us.
And local money. I mean, we've seen it in Poland, we're seeing it in Czech, that there is local money that's starting to, and they're typically developers that have built up enough cash that they're willing to now go ahead and kind of structure themselves for the next phase of the cycle. And I think they're doing it almost as a defensive play, seeing that we're getting close to the top.
Okay, we've got. I'm going to pick another question from Slido that's getting a lot of likes. Given the availability of space in most Polish cities, in comparison to typically more densely developed cities in Western Europe, do you see a higher risk overdevelopment? High risk of overdevelopment, I think that should be, yeah.
I think in all places you need to closely monitor what are the growth rates from international students, which are the primary target group. You need to have a clear eye on the structure of sources. Where are they coming from? And need to factor this into your growth plans. But also in other European countries, we have this situation that there is still an absorbing element by the multifamily resi market. And as said, I'm pretty convinced that in CEE, as in other European markets, the lower end of quality, where you have a mismatch between quality and price points, will suffer first in markets where the demand might come to a plateau or slow down. Yeah, and this, for me, is a pretty obvious trend.
I think that to mitigate this risk that the question is addressing is also a factor that is pretty convenient in this region, is that the properties are pretty open to multi-use. So it's not only student housing that is part of the rented resi family, but also, we haven't mentioned yet, the micro-living, so young professionals. And bigger countries like Germany or Poland with multiple bigger cities where talent moves and doesn't have necessarily the need for a mortgage immediately, so people stay there for 6 months or 2 years without this desire. So they need a bet. So to mitigate the risk of what the questions ask is also to allocate certain number of rooms of that student housing building to micro-living, or to make the rooms usable for both target audiences. And the more eastern we go, the more demand we see proportionally for micro-living. When you look at the projects, private projects in this region, then they have quite significant proportion of young professionals in their premises, not only students. And they have higher purchasing power. They have more reasons to look for community as they uprooted from their original community and they need to stay there. Zoning is pretty flexible, so you couldn't do micro-living and student housing in one building in Barcelona, but you can in Warsaw. And the demographic is very strong and in favor of this young professional age group, as basically people get married 5 years later, mortgage 5 years later than their parents, so they have 5 years longer window of mobility and no commitments, no mortgage, so they prefer this type of accommodation. So I think, especially in CEE region, the combination of student housing and micro-living is something that is not only meeting the demand, but also enables to mitigate the risk.
So Anna, but factoring that in, the sort of the different styles of accommodation, how does that compare to what's being built elsewhere? I mean, is this type of project, this kind of multi-purpose project, sort of being built elsewhere in Europe? Is it a model that's being transferred over to Central and Eastern Europe?
Well, as Samuel rightly said, we have in all over Europe a very strong urbanization trend. Young people want to live in urban structures, and the factors of marrying later, mortgaging later, and having, let's say, a way higher affinity to international education already starting in secondary school. All these trends together lead to a fact that the demand of those in education or those who are professional but not settled yet is pretty similar when it comes to sizes, when it comes to fittings, when it comes to amenities, and potentially on different locations, but let's forget about this for a moment, which allows you to roll out products which embrace the demands of those two groups, which is then, let's say, an age spectrum from 17, 18, let's say, to 28, 29. Yeah? And we do that in all the places in Europe where by regulation we are allowed to do so, which is the case in Germany. We do that in the Netherlands. We do that in CEE. In other countries, for example, here in the UK, where we have a strict set of regulation for PBSA, this now leads to the evolution of PRS, BTR, co-living, whatever name tag you put on it, which is nothing different than, let's say, student accommodation for adults. And this is the model you see in various countries on the continent, as said, where regulation allows it. The demand for those products is unique in all of the countries, but in some areas more or less, like in Spain or areas in Spain, I think it's in Barcelona, same as in Madrid. The limitations are more coming from the regulation.
Okay, I'm going to grab another question off Slido that seems to be popular, and this is coming back to the type of students and a bit more about the demand. Is what is the nationality breakdown of the international students who are studying in Central and Eastern Europe? Do they have the income to afford quality PBSA, as is the case in the UK? I don't know, Samuel, whether that's something that you can answer.
Well, mostly interregional. From the Western European nationalities, Germans are the strongest population. It's usually driven by the particular university. It's not, there is no national pattern. So if there are technical subjects, then it might be more popular by one nationality. If there is a humanities or economy, then other nationalities. The purchasing power of particular nationalities, we have looked at it recently, and of course, Western Europeans can afford more. and long-haul students can afford more, so Chinese, Indian, Brazilian, Saudis. Let's say Ukrainians in Poland or Slovaks in Czech Republic, they would probably opt for public stock, not necessarily predominantly for private stock. But in general, the differences are not huge. For example, Warsaw, when we measure it through student surveys in Warsaw, that the market tolerance, more than 32% of the students from the representative pre-selected sample of students that we interviewed had market tolerance about 350 to 400 euro per month for a private PBSA. We showed them pictures and they were sort of seeing the product but not the brand. And so the price tolerance was really high. And the difference in between the West and long-haul students and the others were probably 50 euro. So it's not a big gap. Yeah. And we basically talking about the price market tolerance of a abstract academic product. They haven't seen it yet. The city has not seen the proper private PBSA as developed in Western Europe. So usually when it comes to the market, the real market tolerance is roughly 100 euro higher, as we saw in Budapest or Brno or other cities in this region. So once the first private project came, like in Brno, it's 460 euro for a double room for 2 people, or 420 for single usage of the double room, and it has become fully occupied in 2 months. So, which is way above the average that the market survey showed, which was 330 euro. So I think that the market tolerance, price market tolerance, is reasonable, not so different in between the nationalities. If we talk about price tolerance of, let's say, Russians or Ukrainians, there are many in Prague or Warsaw or Lublin. There are as many that the proportion of them is enough to fill the premises.
So I wanted to come back to talking a bit more about the investment side. We've kind of touched upon this a bit about the fact that there is a distinct lack of stock. So there's obviously a lot of people wanting to buy. Does that make it a very illiquid market and potentially put off investors if they think, well, I can buy it, but there's not going to be other stuff around?
I don't think so. I think student housing at this stage is still pretty unique, where they believe in the future. If you're going to get into student housing, I think you all inherently already believe that this will become a bigger sector. So I think the fear about it not being liquid and that we haven't had a lot of traditional investment transactions take place. Most of the investors that would be looking in Central Europe have already either invested in Germany or the UK or somewhere else. So they realize we're probably 5 years behind Western European countries. So I don't think that plays as much of a factor. I do think it will the further, frankly, south you go within Central Europe. I think Romania, you might have more of an issue there, definitely Bulgaria, but that's the same for any asset class. If you're looking at capital cities, Warsaw, Prague, Budapest, I think the only liquidity question is really when will I be able to sell it? When can I build a portfolio enough that I can then go ahead and move it onto the market?
And in terms of, we've talked about this, obviously it's a very new asset. What about in terms of the market cycle? Where is it in the investment cycle, and is it counter-cyclical?
Where's student housing, or where's the general investment cycle?
It's student housing.
Well, I think it's probably counter-cyclical because Mark touched on it in the report, but what students spend on their accommodation and on their schooling in general doesn't really shift regardless of where we are in the economic cycle, and definitely doesn't impact from the real estate cycle. So the income in a lot of respects is going to be much more steady than retail incomes or office incomes if the market turns over the next 3-4 years. So firstly, I think it's counter-cyclical. So I think that that is also another reason why we are seeing more and more interest as we get towards the top of the traditional real estate cycle. So for me, I believe that it will be something that will garner more and more interest. And even if the markets drop, arguably student housing interest will increase.
And you mentioned about demand. Is the demand uniform, or is it focused on very particular areas? And a sub-question to that, if I may, are there any areas that people are perhaps overlooking that they should look at?
Student housing is probably getting the most attention, followed by PRS, followed by senior care or senior living. All three of them fall in the same bucket with different variations to them. But senior housing is probably the one within Central Europe that has probably got the least attention, and I think that's because that's going to require more of a structural change from the governments in terms of being able to support that product, because it's not a high income product. You're not having a lot of senior citizens in Central Europe that can afford 500 euros a month for their accommodation. So that's going to be much more a fundamental change in how the governments react to that issue, and it is coming. I mean, you can see it in the demographics. It will happen, and there's not enough senior care facilities in Central Europe, and then it's compounded by the fact of kind of the exodus in some countries of the working population, which traditionally would have taken care of their parents, is now in Italy or Germany or wherever else. So senior housing is probably the one that has the biggest question mark. PRS, I think, is right alongside student housing and will kind of develop alongside it going forward. I mean, as Rainer said, it's not a fundamental difference in the business model. It might be, instead of 18 square meters, it's 24 square meters that you build, but the premise behind it is essentially the same.
Okay, I'm going to grab a question off here that's getting a lot of likes, and this is probably one for you, Rainer. Do lower rents versus the rest of Europe lead to lower operating margins, or are operating costs correspondingly lower?
The latter is the case. You definitely have the situation that in countries like Iberia or in Poland, workforce is way cheaper than in other countries like Germany or France or in the Netherlands, and that to a certain extent balances this off. Yeah? And the rent differential isn't that huge. Yeah? So if I compare, for example, German secondary cities where price points are somewhere around 550 to 600 euros all in, and compare these with Budapest or with Prague or Warsaw, there isn't a lot of a gap. Yeah? It's something different if you look into Barcelona and have a hard time finding something below 1,000 euros. Yeah? So there is, and I think that also complies with what Samuel just said. Where are these people coming from when you look at the Western European traffic into the country? It's the Germans. Yeah? It's to a certain extent, when it's medical faculties, also the Italians. Yeah? And for them, it's not a huge saving, or the idea is not to get into an environment where the higher education price tag is way lower than in their home countries. Yeah? It's other motivations mainly. And in the light of this, I don't see that the argument of potentially lower rents is something that really affects the attractiveness of the sector in CEE.
Hi, Seb Horst from Tiger Developments. Probably a question for Luke, I think. You mentioned that the appetite for investment into CEE is pretty high, but given the lack of stock, that's a bit of an issue. In terms of development funding and funders looking to support or fund actual building, is the appetite similar or perhaps a bit more? You mentioned about pre-sales for resi and student not having that.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a lot of kind of capital asking us in the last 12 months, do you know any developers that need funding? And our answer is generally no. The developers in Central Europe that are being active at this stage have enough equity on their balance sheet to typically do projects on their own. There's not a lot of distressed developers with land bank right now. Those were kind of cleaned up, I would say, 5-6 years ago, either acquired or just folded. So the only time that we really see it is where you've got maybe more of a local developer that has equity but maybe has larger expansion plans or wants to get into a new segment. So in short, there is the money there to fund the developers, but at this stage the developers aren't really looking for equity in most cases because they can handle, they're already at capacity for the most part.
Hi, Adam Bosman from M3. Probably a question for Wojciech. How prolific are restitution claims in CEE?
I would say it's not a problem in many countries, like Czech Republic, it's not a problem at all. In Poland, you would only have some issues within Warsaw, but it's not really. I mean, if you do your proper due diligence, then you're fine. You can buy without any concerns. So I would say it's not really no longer. It's been really 30 years, almost 30 years since reintroducing of democracy in the countries. So I would say, with exception maybe of some limited cases in Warsaw, it's no longer a big issue.
The only country that I would say still has kind of an ongoing issue is Romania.
Yeah, Romania probably, but it's probably the only country.
Yeah.
And it's not that you've got every time you've got a problem.
No.
So they say again, no issues in some countries, and probably Romania some issues, and in Poland mainly Warsaw. But you can, if you have good lawyers, they'll take care of the problem. And they'll advise you whether there is a problem or not. So.
Charles Simmons from Edgar Simmons Property. Luke, earlier you mentioned there's been a significant increase in the development costs or the construction costs of property. I mean, we're quite active in Portugal and we're developers ourselves as well. I just wanted to see what your sort of views are on construction costs going up. Is it purely just a supply and demand sort of thing, or are there other factors or key factors driving those increases in construction costs?
It's largely the cost of labor. So if you look at Central Europe, I mean, unemployment in Czech is effectively zero. Poland, I think it's 4% right now. Wage growth is ranged on average between 10 and 15% across our markets. And the bulk of that lies in your blue collar jobs, so the construction sector, manufacturing, etc. So that's been I think the biggest driver in construction costs is frankly the labor. The supplies obviously in certain areas have increased significantly as well, which has compounded the problem. So it's more to do with the broader economic situation in Central Europe than it is a construction-specific issue, because it's happening in manufacturing as well. I mean, you look at Volkswagen just increased wages 15% across the board in Hungary last week, and that's been happening pretty regularly over the last while. So, I don't see it necessarily slowing down in the next 12 months, which is unfortunate, but on the other hand, I think it may cool some of the market, which arguably isn't a bad thing, because it's getting to the point where the developers' margins are getting squeezed. So they're starting to pull back on their pipeline.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
And I assume some students will be working in these countries. If they get better wages, they'll be able to.
I'd be a construction worker now.
Not only construction, I'm talking generally. The unemployment in these countries is very low, and many students do work and can afford better accommodation as a consequence.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and we haven't really touched on it, but this is one thing I think that's also holding back the student accommodation is the lack of support from the governments. And you're probably in a better position, either one, Samuel or Reiner, to comment on this, but it's our view that the local governments, maybe with the exception of Poland, have not understood the benefits of private student housing. They view it as competition. They're not realizing that it should attract a better quality of student, more income coming into the country, and then students that also potentially stay on and help develop the economies afterwards. And I think that trick has been missed by the local authorities. Okay,
we have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to ask the panel to all answer this final question if they can. Which countries, regions and cities provide the best investment case, both short and longer term, in this sector?
From an institutional point of view, I think it's Poland. as it provides a big variety of investment opportunities. From a personal point of view and with a more entrepreneurial spirit, I would tend to go further south and would also look at, let's say, the neighbors of the region, for example, Serbia and countries like that, yeah. But this is, let's say, it requires a little bit of a wild, wild west mentality in these countries today, and it's not a scale play.
Yeah, I pretty much agree. I mean, Poland's the clear favorite in terms of, I think, size, being able to build out a platform, and having multiple places where you can put different product. So yeah, for me, it's Poland.
I think for the region is not so big to be too selective, let's say. So I think the capitals are no-brainer. So Warsaw, Prague, Bratislava, and Budapest. Kraków, I would be careful there about the factoring in all the pipeline already there. So that's about the demand-supply dynamics. Brno as well as a tier 2 city, but tier 2 cities offer better gains as well. Bratislava is an opportunity for few players. The market is relatively small. As Rainer said, for example, Maribor is a very interesting one. Small, limited opportunity for few, but the airport was bought by Chinese. The university is promoting itself in China. They will have more Chinese students. Somebody will build something soon there. Belgrade is a good one in terms of lack of stock in number of English taught programs and appetite of universities. On the other hand, Bucharest, as Mark's numbers also showed, is pretty well supplied now. And even though they have quite many international students and English taught programs, but supply is quite strong, so I would be careful over there. And I think Bulgaria is far from being considered for the next 5 years, I think.
I guess my analysts have already answered the question. I'll only say that in terms of legislation, it's probably as good as everywhere as it, and let's hope that legislators don't believe there's a gap and try to fill it, so that we have some legislation. So let's hope that it stays the way it is, that allows flexibility, and looks like it's going to be this.